Okay, people are arriving. Good. And I got here slightly ahead of time. 5 minutes early is, the time usually. But I didn't demonstrate that last time around, so trying to be better. Yeah, so I actually have in my tiny little studio apartment here in St. Paul, I have guests today, but they're going about their own business. So, but I've got my Bluetooth thingies in. So
I
yeah,
spent
so
a semester um, in the college seminary there in St. Paul back in
hmm,
1980.
yeah, I'm right off of Grand Avenue, so morning. I'm within walking distance of the college I teach at, which is right next to the cathedral, actually, and also within walking distance of McAllister and St. Thomas, and it's a great place to
Yeah,
be.
I thought it was a gorgeous city. I mean, coming from Michigan and the Detroit area. I mean, I'm not actually from the Detroit area, but I've been there enough to know that St. Paul, Minneapolis sure was cleaner.
Mhm.
But this was back in 1980, so
Yeah, yep, yep. So yeah, so it's been fun. It's the weather hasn't really turned yet here. So I've been kind of lucky that we haven't had a major storm. The leaves are very colorful. They're still on the trees. Um, I think we've had a frost or two, but very mild kind of end of the summer and beginning of the fall, which is kind of amazing that it's going to be November in a week.
yeah.
Yep. So how's everybody else doing?
Concerned.
Okay. Concerned. Holding your breath until it's all over.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. Over.
it's a yeah, yeah. Hopefully it'll be over when it's over. Yeah. And it'll be on Guy Fawkes Day. All right.
That's my concern, is that it won't be over when it's over. And so I'm kind of
Yeah.
really planning to lighten my students' workload next week and hole up here, and
Mm.
self-care,
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny. I was in my US history courses last week was the Second World War, which, is kind of bizarre that we do, World War II in just one lecture and one discussion. But I was in the discussion. We were talking about I said, well, okay, there's a lot going on right now, so so let's actually try to understand what people mean when they call each other fascists or neo-Nazis and stuff. So we tried to, I put the words on the board and we tried to, add some, defining characteristics of first fascism and then Nazism, and then, to what extent was Franklin Roosevelt either of them, and I helped him get to the point where we decided he was not. But
my family thinks
because
he was all like the original American socialist. I'm surprised that you have college students who think he was fascist.
well, the thing is, he was attacked from both directions, right? So, so while the conservatives and the Hoover people, even before the election and the inauguration, and that whole Smedley Butler plot and all of that was coming at him from the right. Later during the New Deal, Huey Long was coming at him from the left. So yeah, but we had added enough elements to the board um, about the other elements of fascism that he didn't demonstrate at all. And then of course once you got to Nazism, it added in the scapegoating and the anti-Semitism and the eugenicism and all of that. Then yeah, I don't know. Maybe I sort of have this hope that some of the things that I talk with students about will sort of echo in the present, because most of them are not on their way to becoming historians by any stretch of the imagination. So that's kind of a thing that I'd at least like to kind of leave them with some understanding of, not necessarily solid causality, but at least a general imagination of, how we might have gotten to this point. So I think everybody who's here is here. So good morning, and we can kind of begin. So part 2 of Bob's book. Anybody have any general impressions to start us off?
It's a beginner impression. I've been putting it to work this week, and my Zettelkasten is just taken off. It's been just so much fun. I just didn't get it before. I just didn't get it, but it's really starting to. Obsidian has that graph view that you can play with, and mine was just like stars in the sky. It's starting to look more like a rhizome now, and it's just really exciting. And the numbering system is making me think about my notes, and they're so much richer and stronger than they were even 10 days ago. I'm
Excellent.
loving this book, and so grateful to you guys for letting me come to book club.
Oh, cool.
Hey, Virginia, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
You just mentioned that the numbering system makes you think more about the notes. Can you go into that further?
What Bob says about it forces you to make a link. I wasn't link dumping, I was note dumping. I'm like a hoarder, I see an article I like, bam, and it goes, or I have a thought, bam, and it goes. But he says you really are forced to think about why that thing that you're writing down is important. What does it mean? Where does it fit? And in doing that, like this morning, I was making a note. I don't even remember which one, but it was like a totally different note when I got done with it than it was when I started with it. And in fact, it was 2 notes. So yeah, it makes me think more than I did before. I would just throw a note in and I would link it to something if I could think of something, but it was really random.
Yeah, the long note thing is something that has sort of been challenging to me too sometimes, because I tend to like that form of, just essaying or writing a daily note that will be 500 or 1,000 words long, and will go to a bunch of places that I hadn't necessarily been planning to go to, and I think that oftentimes that's kind of valuable, but it is then a challenge, I think, and an extra step that I have to force myself to take too, to kind of say, all right, now I'm going to actually identify the ideas that I had as kind of atomic ideas that can then be shuffle the cards with other ones and that sort of thing. Tim, in the community forum, I think it was, you had something, said something about Morgan and her idea about dumping ideas and then letting something evolve.
Yeah, she still makes the one big file for a session of reading. But she's not explicit over whether she makes it over the next few weeks of reading or whether it is literally a session, because it's difficult to tell how fast people read, etc.
Yeah.
But that's often been one of my bugbears, particularly with us here. We read a section and in theory stop, such that we try not to preempt what the book finishes with and give away the plot too much. Yes, they're either spoilers or bloopers. Yeah, and it's one of those things that's been a problem. A bit like Virginia was saying, she sees an article she likes, and because I'm digital in that context, it's 2, 3, 4 clicks, and I've got a whole article as a source, but I've also maybe picked up a few highlights. I don't use Readwise in that context, but those that do, you get the same problem in the sense of you finish that period of reading, and particularly if you ask Readwise to send it to you every day, rather than activate a export from Readwise to you, you've got these ongoing problems with what happens if you start massaging your long collection that may be the finish of the book or the finish of the article, and then you go back to it tomorrow and you go back to it the day after. You've got to keep a very good track on what the automated elements of the read it later type apps do, and how you then do your next step. Are you a good boy in sense of you finish your dinner before you touch your dessert, or do you go backwards and forwards? And in part, I think it's horses for courses. I find if the smaller the thing, the easier it is just to do it. And it's not quite the David Allen. If it takes 2 minutes, just do it.
Sounds a bit like it.
But it's more like if it takes 20 minutes, just do it. It might even be 2 hours, depending on what pushback you've got.
Or what deadline you've got.
Yeah, and most deadlines are artificial, so I basically put 2 fingers up against most deadlines. And I'm same question really as I raised last week, and I've raised before with the likes of you and I and Pat of being the essay generation. We tend not to think in terms of atomic notes. So that conversion has a level of resistance to work because it's not our natural trained position. And that's taken some considerable effort to push back against, such that Morgan shows how she takes 2 or 3 quotation type notes, puts a comment or 2 to some of them, and in the process goes, well, hang on a minute, when I start typing out this word and I start with a couple of square brackets, Obsidian says I've got that word or that phrase started somewhere else. So she keeps pulling it, making those extra links. And I think the video I pointed to last week was her demonstrating that, although I think she was using Scrintl, which is much the same. But it just gives you a better story or a bit more visual storyboard rather than a pile of notes that you can't see all of it on a screen. And I like, and from last week as well, I like the sleeper come someday maybe stroke tickler file come scratchpad approach. And the scratchpad approach worked well even in Evernote, because you can just create one for today and just dump everything in it. And now the version 10 has got the home page that allows you to drop things on a regular basis into a fixed place. You can always see yesterday's scratchpad until you change it. So they all work well. And I like his early section 2, 2.1, 2.2, 2.3, those various pictures he's got of this is the diagram of my GTD type process. And it's just, there's no weekly or daily review in there. There's no couple of other things that come with GTD, but it's from the note-taking perspective, it seems complete. It's just that there needs to be a bit more what if you are an essay style person, what else do you need to help you step over that and jump off a cliff and start really converting to atomic. And one of the things I've found as a question more than anything, and Morgan doesn't really say in her explanation, if I'm going to do my nominally once-off import from a readwise equivalent, do I keep it in one place and stick it in a folder that is an early, a seedling type early folder, fleeting node folder? And then when I take comments and notes, comments and quotes, ideas from that long list, do I dare delete them off the long list? Because if I'm doing it for this project, it's by definition, in theory, still available for another project further down the line. So if we take,
it's interesting, isn't it, that you know, with these files in, we're talking about mostly Obsidian, right? And Markdown files are so small, unless you load them with images or things like that, that there's really not an argument from a kind of a storage perspective that that there's an old story that that Jaron Lanier tells, right? And when he's in his books, he channels Ted Nelson a lot, and he says, well, Ted Nelson's idea of hyperlinking was there would be only one original and everything would link to it. And so there would be, a breadcrumb trail all over the web. But the problem was the pipes are too narrow and the storage relative to the bandwidth was less expensive. And so they just proliferated everywhere. I also use the Readwise was really the only automation that I kind of allow in my system is the sweep from the, from Kindle and Hypothesis through Readwise into one big file.
Yeah, well, as I said last week, I finally managed to get all of the collection right back to day one almost of OneNote and Evernote. And the Obsidian has what looks like one big flaw. And that's by default, when you import stuff, everything that's not text gets put in a folder called attachments. And that's on a per vault basis. So luckily I imported all the stuff I haven't fluffed into a separate vault. And from the 40,000 notes, there's 180,000 pictures in the attachment file. And none of them
do they stay attached?
They stay attached because when you the text.
I'm sorry.
Sorry, well, I didn't catch that, Florian.
I'm sorry. My mother was British. Half my family's been there.
Well, at least you're not sorry Canadian, but never mind. But when you look at the folder, and you show yourself thumbnails of all those pictures, and you've accidentally said, "Oh, it's about the book, whichever book we want to talk about," and I've grabbed, say, the Amazon page. The problem is you've now also grabbed the last 3 weeks of your purchases and all the pictures of the people, what other things. So you can't, because you can't easily control what you pick up, you've got thousands of these tiny pictures that make no sense. So it was like, okay, providing it's not clearly a proper document, because it also does that occasionally with PDFs. So if you've got a PDF inside a web page, it becomes an attachment unless you move it back in. So I went down and drew a line at like 10K, and everything below that I just deleted. And so that's a few thousand icons that say Twitter or X or Facebook as well. So, and they of course come up on multiple pages. So I've just cleaned it up from there, and it threw away well over 100,000 files like that, and about 2 gigabytes. So it's if you're using their sync and or your own cloud service to sync between devices, 2 gigs is not for nothing in that context. So I was quite happy with that, and now it's just a case of I just search that extra vault before I search anywhere else.
Right.
Is there something related? And I will now transfer those few files over to the active vault's source files. So that makes it work.
You copied in. Are those like atomic notes, or are those just kind of more the essay style that Dan was talking about?
At the moment, they're coming over at whatever size they are currently, until I go and use them. So they might last 10 minutes or they might last 10 days, but they'll come over as is for now.
I was just wondering about the nature of them, because from like what Dan was talking about, where he would go and put in pretty much an essay or whatever, I would kind of treat those as like source notes to be processed into the individual point notes that are in there and stuff like that. And when you were talking, Tim, about basically, for lack of a better term, dumping, tens of thousands of notes into the system and stuff, unless they were already pre-processed down to usable atomic-ish notes and stuff, it seems like all you've done is built up this big backlog of things to reprocess later.
So you picked it. You've picked up the wrong end. I've got 2 vaults. One vault is the dump vault. As and when I search that and find a note in there that's relevant, I copy that one note or those 2 notes, whatever, put them in the folder source in the same way as Bob's talking about source, and then process, is it really a source, as in it's an academic paper, or is it a web page article that I just want a few paragraphs? So it then gets either processed and stays put because it's a big enough thing that's likely to be reused, or it gets dropped and that copy gets deleted.
So you've essentially got another vault, is what Bob calls the sleeping folder.
Right, which is what Chris just said in the chat. But I think another thing that maybe you're getting at, John, is that it also could be like like the bookshelf behind you, right? You have selected, there's a little bit of a selection going on, but but to what you're saying, Tim, when I go back to one of those books, I don't throw the book away then, right? Because I know there's other, there's more stuff in it. So that's a question with the fleeting notes too, as well, right? The things that
exactly, and even when Chris has piped up, or we've picked up things about Luhmann's system, a reading is that he never seemed to go back to read something again. Yet when you look at his actual notes, you see him constantly going back to look at an old paper or an old book. Mm-hmm. And it's like, why would I throw, at worst, Encyclopedia Britannica off the shelf type thing? Right. And the nice thing in some respects, of course, outside of electronic copies don't really have marginalia as an actual thing. You can highlight, and most of the time, if you can highlight, you can add a comment willy-nilly, and they're there and searchable. Mm-hmm. So, and even something as simple as Calibra, that can organise a book-ish library, which is now expanding more. Or if you've come more from a paper direction and you're using Zotero, that now can do more document types up to and including podcasts and audio files and all the rest of it. You've still got one place, at worst 2 places, to look for your source and your previous visitation. Every time, and not every book that you've got, do you intentionally read cover to cover anyway. That's why we have indexes and table of contents, because it's a textbook type thing. You want a particular, I need to know about last ice age. I don't need all ice ages. I don't need all geology, and I don't need everything about sea ice. I just need the last ice age. So that all of that in one go isn't coming through with Bob, particularly at the moment. And I'm hoping that this section 3, which is back when we were talking about doing this book, and I'd seen the contents, I go, oh, right, section 3 is the bit I want. I'm not too fussed about section 1 and 2.
I was interested what was missing for you, and because I've read the book twice already, so maybe I can kind of give you a hint if it's going to be in section 3. It's about the turning the material into writing, or what kind of?
No, I partly because being the senior citizen type person around here, I'm not comfortable with producing 250 atomic notes, dumping them into a general folder that has another 10,000 atomic notes, and then going, okay, other than if I put a pile of tags in, how do I pick those 250 notes back up? Whereas if I've got an essay or a read-wise equivalent dump out from a book with highlights and comments, I've got one place to look. And I can also, because it still shows up in the electronic book, I can open the electronic book and say, oh, when I read this 6 months ago, I didn't know the word Ice Age. So I didn't pick up the highlights for Ice Age in this particular book back then. Now I need to do that. And because I can see what the old work was in its totality, and I can see what my new current project is, I feel that I'm in a better position to do it once more. I don't need to go everywhere. Every time.
There's a question also about sort of emergence versus determinism, right? Because you're making, if you're tag, I mean, it's not, I don't know, it just strikes me that it's not really an either or, that if you're tagging, that's good for now, but the things that are attracting your attention that you're tagging now may not be the only things as well. Florian in the chat mentioned there's no such thing really as atomic. There's no official agreed upon definition. So it's kind of what we all sort of agree to use the idea.
And in some respects, you could easily turn around and say, atomic is my 3,000 word essay, or my 7,000 word. 7,000 word output.
You have to justify that, really. I mean, so all of the examples or the analogies that I'm using, are unusable other places. I think that'd be super.
As a slight aside, one of the things I was going to find a space today or next week to slip in is a comment about what's the next book. And as I've done occasionally, we've done an awful lot of very American biased, very American authored ones. For other reasons, I happened to pick up Rory Stewart's political biography the other day and thought, oh, this is, even though he's a right-wing ex-Tory MP, etc., it comes over as being a good read, and covers a lot of the things that we have done in either the big myth or the American myth or various bits on poverty, etc. And so it seemed like a good idea. And in the intro, he says about the fact that he just literally brain dumped the whole book and then realized it was 200 and something odd thousand words and he'd have to cut it down. So it's given. Yeah.
Can I make a point about that? I think there's in the chat, there's something about atomicity. If I can even pronounce the word, it's an annoying word. But I think I think it's just like, and I think Bob already discusses it as well in the book. I'm kind of curious what your thoughts are. I think it's just a guideline. It's like there's nothing religious about it. I think like who fucking cares if you put more ideas in one note? I actually like the idea of like having one idea per note instead of
Mhm.
like atomic. Like what's atomic? Is it like from physics? Like what are we talking about? So it's
Mhm.
just kind of jargon essentially. It's just fucking jargon. Like can I even swear? Sorry. It's just jargon. Yeah. Sorry. So for me it's just, and then it's a nice guideline. I think from the Zettelkasten.de, I think Christian Tietze coined this term, if I'm not mistaken, 2013 or something. So that just shows the recency of the term itself.
Mhm.
I think for me, the way I can kind of determine how kind of small my note is by looking at the title. I kind of give declarative titles to my notes. So by forcing myself to write like a statement or declarative statement in the title itself, I kind of narrow it down to one idea or one fact or like one thing, basically. So that's kind of the guidelines I use. I think Bob always, I don't know, someone in the chats asked something about that. I'm not sure if I kind of answered it. I think, um, I
To
don't
your
know,
point,
but that's, yeah.
Mohammed, part of why I consider what I've got in my Obsidian stuff not to be kind of a Zettelkasten and stuff, but at best source notes, is they're not atomic. Because to me, atomic gets it to where it's reusable, almost Lego pieces that you could
Yeah.
rebuild into articles or other arguments or what have you and stuff.
Mm.
So, and that's one of the things where, again, where do you draw that line? You could go, stupidly far and you got notes that don't mean much, or you've got something too big and they
Yeah.
aren't reusable.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
maybe a rule of thumb is the sort of thing that in a college essay you would decide whether or not you had to footnote or cite, right? When was what was the approximate timing of the last glacial maximum, right? That's kind of common knowledge if you go to the right, if you're in the right community looking at the right sources. So I wouldn't expect, somebody writing a paper that, about Beringia to actually have to cite that. So maybe that's a sort of an approximate measure of whether that needs to be its own even source note.
Yeah,
But
another
because something
question.
else that was
Yeah.
much more particular, that the dates of the Yana RHS Siberian
Mm.
archaeological finds, I would want to be able to find where I learned that, and so I would want there to be a source note that I could cite for that.
Yeah, question to John. So for me, like the thing, Bob discusses it as main notes basically. I try to keep those atomic. All my other notes are not atomic. So uh, I have like many other notes in the Zettelkasten, right? So
Mhm.
I've like reference your source notes. I don't make atomic. Like why the fuck?
Right,
Why would I do
exactly.
that?
They shouldn't be
Yeah. So
atomic.
they shouldn't be because you're reading a book and you're trying to kind of comment as you read, make observations, comment on a piece of paper or like in a digital file. So those aren't atomic for me. I have another type of note in my system, which is, I call it the index. Those
Mhm.
are just like names of people or locations or a topic like capitalism, Western capitalism, those kinds of notes. They generally stay empty because why do they stay empty with my system? It's just because I link to them from like a source. So if I read something, I'm like, oh, this is Western capitalism. I make the link. And because it's linked, I can kind of keep that empty. So I never force myself to write index notes. I like 99% of the I would say 90% of the time they're empty. So for me, it
Well,
really differs per node. And I think the
yeah.
atomic principle is basically for the main nodes, which kind of confuses some people at the beginning when starting a Zettelkasten, I think. So yeah.
Well, that's part of why I prefer Dan's terminology of source notes and point notes and stuff. Because main
Mm,
notes is ambiguous, whereas a point note is I am trying to make a point, this is my thought.
Mhm.
And those I think should be atomic so they're reusable and stuff. Source notes, I agree, totally not atomic. It's just kind of the reference note that's talked about and or the
yeah.
bibliography note or what have you. And I think your use, I'm assuming, of the local graph view around like Western civilization and stuff, I think that's a great use of the Obsidian tool and stuff. So you can see everything kind of related to it without having to have done any legwork other than creating a placeholder node.
exactly.
Well,
Yeah, and
which
I actually
actually,
main notes I don't really like. Sorry, Dan. Main notes
okay.
so point notes I think are much better because I don't know. I've never thought about this terminology, but I think main notes is like what makes them better than like reference notes or index. I don't think that. So right, like it almost
Yeah.
assumes like it's the main attraction, which I kind of would
Mhm.
disagree. So I think Dan, to your kind of to your point, I don't know. Maybe it was your invention of point note. I actually kind of like that more. So
Well, and I like source note over reference note because to me, a reference note is something I will go back for reference versus a
Well, I
source.
guess
It's
that,
just,
yeah,
it's
because
where did it come from?
I think that points,
interesting.
I think that's a good point, John. I think that points to the question of the atomicity of the sources or the size of the sources, right? I think a source, again, like like a book on the shelf, when I read it 5 years from now, I will get something completely different from it, probably because I will have gone to it looking for something maybe a little bit different. And so, and so the chat conversation Roman and Timmy are having in the um, I don't remember what the original. I think that's all a child off an original note higher up. But in any case, I won't look for it. About if the source, if you imagine the source as the book that you read, well then hell yeah, there's going to be a lot of stuff. It's going to be long, and it's not going to be easy to atomize. It does seem like you want to move from that um, kind of
Well,
potential library of things that you could look
if
at to
you want to
things
reframe
that
it,
you want to points that you want to make about it.
if you want to reframe it another way, you can think of it too, and some of it comes down to how you want to define atomic or even molecular, where other things
There you
happen.
go.
But
Folded protein.
but you can look at it as a database with columns and rows, and you're going to put different types of data descriptors in the column and row headings, and then you're going to use that to find a thing in the middle that is then has another definition that's expanded upon by the two things. So Muhammad's idea of taking capitalism and indexing it, which other people would call tagging, and you're using it as a way to find all the tags that you have on capitalism so that when you want to do that work on the topic of capitalism, you can go find the 4,000 things you've collected in your lifetime and then distill something down from that. Hopefully useful.
Right. Another thing you could do in a tool like Obsidian is you could stick all that in a folder, right? Because there's this sort of ongoing dialogue about, you have it all in one big folder and just look at it alphabetically or numerically if you're numbering your notes, or alphanumerically in the thing, and then let them sort of randomly associate in the graph. But if you put them in folders, then you can open the folder as its own vault and see all of the capitalism things, right? Or in my case, I've got a bunch of them, all of the environmental history things, or all of this or all of that. So so I do think that the tools afford you different things. If you're using cards, that's a different process involving indexes, I guess.
Yeah. But that's the thing too, is if you're using cards, you have to index or cross index and have, topic words or topic sections so that when you want the thing you're looking for, you can more easily find it. Now in Luhmann's case, he would in his index is incredibly sparse. So a guy who spent his whole life on, sociology, you go to his index and there's only 2 entrance points into sociology in his index, which just, is baffling on one point. But if you're a young student who's into sociology and you're trying to use his card index to help you out, it's going to be useless. You'll find a starting point, but then you've got to read it all. But
Yeah.
for him, literally every note in his index would be about sociology, so it becomes totally useless to have 8 million index entries on the topic.
Right.
So you have to be careful of what your long-term interests are.
Because that's just the water he's swimming in. Yeah. But
he gets away with it. But
yeah.
at the other side of it, if you go back, and I mentioned Beatrice Webb's section on note taking in my apprenticeship, if you read it carefully, she's actually describing an early version of a database, how she's taking notes and what she's writing down, 1 fact per card. And in fact, somewhere in there, she says too, if you are as a historian, you're writing, you should only ever have one date per card because using multiple dates is going to muddy things up and get you away from that atomic idea.
Sure.
So you should only ever have one date so that when you're sorting through things and trying to find data, and she literally, in some senses, is using a lot of her Zettelkasten as a database.
Mhm.
But she's also separately using it for writing the way we're talking about here. But because there weren't computers and people really didn't have databases, that data management thing and using charts and graphs for her were a lot harder for the types of work she wanted to do. So she used this other method as a crutch to some extent, whereas now most of us would probably collect a bunch of stuff in an Excel spreadsheet and, go from there.
Mhm. Or an actual database that's more than two-dimensional. Yeah. But
yeah, or MySQL, or some other.
Right, right. And I thought to kind of drag it back to Bob's book, I think that what we're talking about is, for me, it seems to be on, what page is this? It says 11 minutes left on the chapter. That's not helpful. 85 in the Kindle. Keep an eye out for when but and however show up in your note making. Whenever I write either of these two words, he says he's reminded that this is a new thought, right? This is a thought about the relationship of the ideas. So I think that's
Almost
kind of
any conjunction, really.
Yeah. Yeah, or yeah,
However,
Yeah,
those
and.
sorts of things.
Even and, yeah, sure. Yeah. So I think that's helpful to me,
So you're saying, Dan, we should take notes the way Hemingway wrote, short, smart, punchy little.
Yeah. Yeah, and then obsess over that
we
word.
shouldn't-
I
I gotta
had a
tell
hard
my
day.
students, think Hemingway, not Faulkner.
Yes.
Or not, like the first sentence is 4 paragraphs worth of stuff in Dickens's A Tale of Two Cities.
Mhm.
That's not one note, that's 57 all strung together.
Well, that was an abstract of the book, though, wasn't it? Really kind of. That's another lost art, right? The writing of 250 word abstracts.
Well,
Actually
are you, Dan, advising your students not to write like Macaulay and copy his style?
Yeah, no, I think yeah.
Is that a problem?
I have actually had students do in like a methods class, had students practice writing abstracts, just because nobody does that anymore. I thought it'd be fun. And really it's only because somebody made me do that in grad school once, and I found it an interesting challenge.
I have a small bone to pick about Bob's book, and I think the word that appears in it most often beyond A's, ands, thes is the word process. And I'm not a big fan of the word process because I think it nudges people who come into this. And I've seen a lot of people like start a Zettelkasten and abandon it immediately.
Yeah.
And it's because the word process and processing and the need to feel like you're processing things always, which leaves a lot of, especially beginners, the impression that you should take notes on everything. And now you've read a book and you've got, you may have 500 annotations in your book. And now you need to process all of them, which means you need to go back and turn every single one of those things into some really great, perfected atomic note. And it gets even worse when you get into people talking about evergreen notes, like all these tiny little seeds you plant, you have to grow them into a massive farm.
You gotta water them, you gotta weed around them.
This is not a game of Farmville where you're trying to win by like showing up every day and you're watching every tiny seed. If you're a sociologist, focus more on the sociologies. Sure, make all those annotations, but shove them off into your sleeping folder in a place where you can search and find them I guarantee you will have a memory of, I know I read this somewhere once.
Mhm.
And if you've highlighted it and annotated it or indexed it properly, with a minute or two of searching, you'll be able to find the thing because you'll know roughly where to look.
Yeah.
But you don't need 8 million, point notes or, great done atomic notes. So quit focusing on the process and focus on the thing you came for. So you may read, if you're an intellectual historian and you read Bob's book, you're going to take more in-depth, interesting notes on it than the average reader who may, write down 5 things, and the 5 things they write down, that's all they're going to get out of it. And
Right.
maybe
Or
that's all
if
you
you're a
need.
sociologist and you read A Tale of Two Cities, you're going to be, your that world that you live in is going to inform what you get out of it. But the other things that occur to you, yeah, maybe you put them in a sleeping folder, and they and they exist there if you ever go a different direction.
But I
Yeah,
think there's just far too much focus on process, and not focus.
yeah,
And once you figure out how to like have all the cruft over here, your scrap heap,
yeah.
so that you can search it if you need it, but then have all the best, most useful stuff. And that's really, somebody asked me this week, because you can search through my hypothesis account, and you'll find everything from individual words highlighted and tagged all the way up to, if you search, you'll find full essays I've written in the margins, like just nearly journal articles in and of themselves hiding in there. And somebody asked me, so you've got these 20,000 plus notes in a hypothesis. And I think that he's mentioned there's only about 19,000 and some change that are public. But like, what is that? How many is that? Fleeting notes? Is that, atomic notes? Is it something else? And it's like,
Does,
yeah,
and
no,
does
it's
it
a
matter?
spectrum.
Yeah,
But I know it's all there and I can search for it.
sure.
And
Yeah.
the atomic stuff is the best stuff that I visit the most often, and typically tends to be better interlinked and most useful to me. But I know it's all there if I need to search for it.
Well, and one of the things,
I don't worry about process anymore. The process, I read it, I write the thing, and I move on.
yeah.
And I make 50 fleeting notes a day, and maybe 2 turn into something useful. But it may take 3 weeks for that one of those 2 to show up and turn into the thing. But I think too many people come away with the impression that like every fleeting note you make has to be a thing, and
Yeah, and who do you owe it to?
you're wasting your time. It's like, so there are some people who, like, you start reading a book and it's a horrible, terrible, bad book, but you feel somehow guilty that you need to read the whole thing because you started it.
Yeah.
Don't, life is short. Don't waste your life like that.
Yeah.
I
Well,
agree
I think
about
it's also interesting that there's there's sort of a question of stages too, right? That that there's this, that maybe, I mean, it's kind of funny because Chris, when you started down that trail, I was wondering whether you're going to talk about processing as, crunching through this data, or as the whole question of process versus product, which I am, sort of sympathetic to. I do think that it probably makes sense to spend more time. I was thinking about, what I'm going to write next, about this in the next version of what I'm going to do. And I think I probably will try to stress a little bit more that there are stages, and that this, you collect sometimes, you refine sometimes, you do, there are these different things you do them at different times, and you do them really mostly with a goal in mind, but a little bit as an investment too. And that sort of occurred to me last week, that some of the things that you're doing and some of the advice that you're taking sometimes isn't it's, I hate to put it in a religious context, but faith is about the things that are unseen, right? About the is not the same as empirical knowledge. And sometimes there's an element of, if you accept or agree that the person that you're listening to or reading their words has some insights to impart. I don't remember where it was this week, but I ran into something that somebody was writing about, how to deal with imperfect people making imperfect arguments. I wish I could remember where it was. It'll pop back into my head, I suppose. But the other thing that interested me, Chris, was the idea when you were talking about Luhmann of Luhmann being of maybe what he was doing, and so he's swimming in this sea of sociology. So he doesn't ever have to say sociology, but also maybe for him, the paucity of tags to things that we think he might tag to might be sort of a little bit of a memory palace thing, that all he has to do is get there, and his brain takes him the rest of the way. So that the slip box is not the only thing that he's got going. He does it's cybernetic, right? He's got part of it in his head, part of it in the box.
Is there any information about how good Luhmann's memory was?
Well, he claims it wasn't, but that suggests to me that it probably was pretty good and he just wasn't satisfied with it.
Yeah, I would agree with that entirely. I don't think you get that many notes if you don't think your memory is bad, but I don't think you can use that many notes if your memory is bad.
Yeah, it's kind of a catch-22 or something.
Yeah, I wanted to comment on the process thing. I think it's true. It's even worse when people highlight, like from the web and books via Kindle. I think Dan has already talked about this a few times, I believe. Like highlighting that stuff, and then you use like a tool or software like Readwise, and then it automatic. You don't have to do anything. It's like, oh, it's so good, it's automatic, right? And then it comes into your Obsidian Vault, and then you automate it in such a way that you have a template for each thing you have annotated. It comes into your vault. You have templated in such a way that there's a status tag, inbox, or process, and so you read a lot of stuff that comes into your vault, and now you have the idea of like you have to force yourself to process all of that, which is just ludicrous. That's like I don't know. That's insane. Even attempting anything like that. That's why I actually don't like Readwise in general, because they are kind of propagating this kind of process and kind of sweep it all into your vault. I think that's the wording you used, Dan. I think that's something you should not do at all, and I think it's a bad idea. For some people, it might work. The thing is that I think it can work when you just highlight it and then integrate it, but then you shouldn't have a status tag of process. It should just be a reference, and your highlight should be your reference. So that's fine. I don't have anything against it. But the moment you add a status tag of have to process, then it's impossible. You can't do it. It's just not doable.
I don't think
if you're gonna have automation, using it to get sources or source notes or whatever into your vault makes sense. Trying to get it anywhere past that, and maybe you could use AI or whatever and get some benefit out of that. But doing it with it's there to be searched on, not it has to be manually processed, is a good model.
Exactly.
Do it in a just-in-time manner.
Yeah, there have been thoughts that people have had and written about online about sort of the legacy of people, right? People's Facebook accounts after they're dead, sort of thing, and I can imagine that type of automation, if it includes AI that then begins to use your own kind of corpus of writing and note making and commenting and stuff as a template, might be a way to kind of achieve some immortality. But how legit, how valuable, would that really be? I mean, is that the argument that Tim and Chris were sort of having, or the conversation about collaborating with dead authors, and whether or not that's actually a thing, or is it just a branding thing so that somebody could write a Ludlum-esque book using Jason Bourne as a character, or not? Was that Ludlum?
Well, worse than that now is that I noticed this week Nick Harkaway has published a George Smiley novel that's between the Spy in the Cold and Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy. They're like 20 years apart. So Nick's gone and dived in the middle. And there's a review that says something along the lines of, but Nick's got a valid reason. He is John le Carre's son. So there's obviously not an estate issue, but...
So it's like Christopher Tolkien editing Silmarillion. Yeah. Well, it's kind of funny because there's a process. I mean, you can just jump into the story world and use all of the predetermined characters and and tropes and things like that. Or you can or there's the other thing where the God, who is the guy? The Lupin novels, right? The detective or the criminal, right? Lupin.
Lupin the
Um,
Third.
Lupin. Yeah, okay. So that was so if somebody went, went and just said, I'm going to adopt this character, I'm going to adopt this world in, Paris or wherever he is, and just write in that style and, and write a new story with a new plot, and a new conflict or a new mystery or whatever, that would be, kind of super derivative, right?
Well, it'd
But
be
what
problematic because I think Monkey Punch, the creator, is still alive doing stuff, although I could be wrong on that. But that gets into copyright issues and stuff like that. But
Well, is this are we talking about the same Lupin?
animated features out of Japan about a thief who's got 3 or 4 people in his team or whatever. Maybe we're talking
Well,
about something else.
I think
Oh,
that's
you're thinking the Netflix show. I'm sorry.
yes, and the
Just
Netflix
derivative.
show is from a set of novels, and I think what you're mentioning, I wasn't really aware of, but I think that probably is also based on that same set of novels.
Yeah, it
And
is. You're right. I'm sorry.
but then also, no, that's cool. And see, and that's in between too, right? That's an adaptation where he's got these people with him, which the original kind of criminal detective Lupin didn't have. But then there's what Hanu Ryanimi did, which is take he's got the characters. I didn't realize that there was a Pellegrini in the original Lupin stories, about the way that that he used that Ryanimi uses it in the Quantum Thief and all, and that trilogy is related but original.
Well, and I would argue none of that is collaborating with the original author so much as leveraging previous works and stuff. And there are cases where, like what I was talking about, it's the grandson of the original Lupin and stuff. So definitely derivative work. But
Yeah.
like in the comic book area, I mean, they're still working on Superman. I mean, it's a different third or fourth version of the character because they've rebooted it a time or two.
Right.
But they're certainly not collaborating with the original authors. And in many cases, they have no idea what the original authors actually wrote with the character. They're just using the now current version
Right.
and kind of spinning on that.
Right. Or Neil Gaiman creates Lucifer in Sandman, and then Mike Carey, and his collaborator takes it someplace else, and then I mean, and Lucifer's gone through like 5 iterations now of series, and but still it's kind of in a conversation with with the questions and the themes and the conflicts that Gaiman had created in a way.
It's all within the conversation. The question is, were some people listening to that conversation or not when they contributed?
Yeah.
Or do you just reframe it as, all the archetypes were created in the Bible and the ones that weren't there are in Shakespeare, and really
Yeah.
there's nothing new after that. So, or maybe there's
which is also in the Bible.
There's 2 or 3 people in the Iliad and the Odyssey, but
Yeah.
I must have missed the Batman chapters of Shakespeare stuff, the Bible, and the Iliad then.
Although this does remind me too of 2 dramatically different ways of using your card index. So there's a well-known historian in the mid 1900s. He just died a few years back. I think he was just over 100 when he died, but he was a dean and provost at Columbia. His name's Jacques Barzun, and he's written some of the greatest stuff in history and about history, ever written. But he was a contemporary and wrote about H.G. Wells, and was a friend and knew Mortimer Adler. But he has a book called was it Modern Research Methods, I think, or the Modern Researcher, and it's gone through like 8 editions, and essentially it's Zettelkasten for historians is roughly what he's writing. But in his private life, because everything was a card index to him, he and a friend maintained a massive card index of detective fiction and literature for decades. And that's what he read for fun on the side, was detective fiction. And so sometime I think it was in the early 70s, the two of them wrote a book on detective stories and detective literature. And I want nothing more than to find their original card catalog of all that stuff, because it's got to be one of the, it would be a wiki fandom now, but
Mhm.
at the time, because it was not distributed, it's a wiki fandom made by two people, but is probably it's probably more complete than any online wiki of Harry Potter fandom in existence now.
That's
But
cool.
it shows like somebody who does this both professionally and as a hobby. He had
But also as
obviously,
a conversation, right, with this other
but
guy.
he's got two boxes, and I'm sure his two boxes occasionally spoke between each other.
Mhm.
Um, but he didn't keep and in part because he shared it with someone else, he probably didn't keep it as one section.
Mhm.
But it's a fascinating example of what you can do with these, depending on your goal and your purpose. And obviously,
Yeah.
in his case, he had two with two dramatically different reasons.
Yeah.
Well,
I
and
mean,
the
it would
goal and the
be,
purpose is a key thing because I'm willing to bet while that was being developed, before they could do kind of here's a history of detective fiction and stuff, if somebody had looked at those notes, they would have claimed, oh, the collector's fallacy, you're getting all the stuff you don't need or whatever. But there was a need for it in that case.
yeah. I would be really fascinated though by the conversation between the two people because I could imagine myself and Stephen Colbert having doing a deep dive into Tolkien, but the directions from which we were coming and our perspectives would be radically different. So it's interesting, and which actually kind of resonates with Blumont's claim that the box is his discussion partner. Although and the other thing, of course, that struck me about that whole thread of thought or conversation was it's certainly it's certainly cool to have nothing else going on in your life so that you can, I remember I think Bob referred to it, that thing where, I work from this time to this time, then I walk my dog, then I work some more, then I walk my dog again, and then and then I go to bed and read until midnight or whatever. And so, it's like my wife is dead, my kids are gone. That's what I'm going to do. So here I am. That was my daughter and her husband who are here for a wedding and are staying with me. But that also resonated too. It's like, well, okay, here I am in my little studio apartment with my books.
Yeah, I think how somebody handles a Zettelkasten is very much determined by how much time they do or don't have to devote to it.
Mhm.
If you're at that point in life where you've essentially retired and got nothing else to do but put stuff into it, that's great. If you're like the rest of us who've got a lot going on, it's a bit harder.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and also yeah, again, the goal to which it's directed, right? So when I go back and revise my thing, it originally was a writing handbook for undergrads at UC Davis writing essays in a complet survey course. So it always had a goal. There was always an endpoint. So it wasn't, so the note making stuff that I added, I think I need to, retain that focus on output and the reading and research thing. But to jump way back or to earlier, a half hour ago, one of the things that Chris, that you were talking about was very Adlerian. It was very much about inspectional reading and then returning to actually do a deeper read and then to do a syntopical read. And so I think that, again, directing it towards a goal, there's a lot sort of to be said for, yeah, the highlights. I mean, and again, these highlights, if we sweep them, if we use Readwise or something to sweep them into some type of a online note system, that still begs the question, at that point, they're no better than yellow highlights in the actual book or marginalia in the actual book, right? It's not until I go back and try to attach that to something that they then switch from being sources to being elements of points that I'm going to make.
In a digital system, I think they are better than the marginalia because they're now searchable.
Yeah. Right, but in terms of the type of idea that they are.
Exactly. There's still source material, but then
Yeah.
you can do the just-in-time processing when you actually decide, hey, I need this,
Mhm.
versus feeling like you've got to have processed everything before you start writing.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's a
Although
definite
again,
principled pragmatic aspect to be had here, and there's a big
yeah.
spectrum there.
The
Well, and
different
I think it's timing also, right? Yeah, because I do believe in that, I have the faith, in what Bob is saying about, sort of doing that work and developing that practice of processing. But I'm not going to do it religiously. I'm not going to do it all the time.
there is a subtle
But
thing you have to do though to create the affordances for the future, for your future self to search the stuff.
Mhm.
So you'll notice earlier, as an example, I dropped a link to note sizes and then separately atomic notes, of which there is a huge overlap. So as you're reading, the word you use today to describe something or to capture an idea topically may be dramatically different, weeks, months, or years ahead. So you've got to be able to remember what the thing is you kind of are filing it under. So I
Or
have
create a
these two things,
thesaurus.
and in my digital system, I have the ability to rename them so that I can maybe find them more easily. But the two ideas are very similar. They're just different words for the same thing. So when you're doing a digital version, having an index or a tagging system that's consistent for you is super useful, particularly if you're ever going to search that thing off in the future. Because if you search for a generic idea, if I search for atomic notes, I'm not going to find the great stuff that Dr. Keith writes about, because that's hiding under note size.
Mhm.
And my note size stuff tends to historically be a lot older, whereas a lot of the atomic note stuff is things people have been writing about since Christian Sitza mentioned, atomicity, 5 or 6 years back.
Well, and
So
that goes to the comment or the discussion we had last week of keyword search versus an actual index and stuff that can handle the different terminology for the same ideas.
and I don't expect AI is going to get good enough to solve that problem for me in my lifetime. So and nor certainly not good enough now, and I'm not going to try and rely on future crazy to pull that off either. So
But Chris, are you then kind of like suggesting to do more just-in-time processing? Because like I kind of would like to shortly come back a little bit to this processing topic. I think it's really really interesting and valuable, because I think that the practice itself to work with your whatever you're using, digital or analog, is helpful to kind of constantly expose yourself with your ideas and the things you're encountering. So again, coming back to my question about do you propose that? Do you suggest that it's maybe better to just in time processing when you want to do something, instead of doing or do pre-work for your future self?
so in a lot of sense, I definitely do that. So there are points where Bob will mention something in the book, and I'll give it a quick underline, but then use a very specific tag of my own in it so that when I'm searching later, I can find it more quickly.
Mhm.
But it may be an idea I've seen 57 times before, and I'll underline it because I know it fits in with how somebody 3 centuries ago dealt with the same idea, and I may want to tie them all together so that as an intellectual historian, I can look at how these ideas and words and verbiage change over time.
Mhm.
And I'll do that, but I'm not going to spend 10 minutes excerpting it now and making a primary card about it, but I'll want to keep it and have it so that I can compare those things,
Mhm.
because there is a general shape to what's going on that I've done enough reading of enough other sources that when I read this, I'm reading at a different level than most people here are, because I have the ability and can compare it to, you
Mhm.
know, Beatrice Webb's work in 1926, or, you know, versions of what Conrad Gessner wrote in Latin in 1548.
Right.
And nobody else here would ever want to do that because it's insane.
But I think that goes to your point about processing and how a lot of beginners get a little overzealous on that. I think there's a certain processing you want to do as kind of that introductory reader to the material and stuff, with the idea that you will come back to it if you need to later as you've got more expertise in that area, and therefore can actually collect better information because you understand it better at that point.
Right.
Well,
And you've left a trail for yourself to come back.
Yeah.
Right? And maybe I missed it during the 45 seconds when I was wrestling with my the case for my things. I don't understand how you twist them in there. But I don't know, I'm damaged in that type of directional thinking, apparently. But maybe somebody said this, but the idea of the tags, I think, is really interesting, because I've really struggled with tags, whether to, how to, all that kind of stuff. And they, there's a way that they snap in if you get them started right, but it's just weird. But I guess the point that I was going to make is, what I feel like I have to do is sort of create a thesaurus of tag terms, right? So that as they develop, especially because, as people are new to the process and going through it, or new to the research that they're doing, even if they have an established process, then the ways that they think about the material are going to change over time. And the thing that you think is interesting right now, as you're a beginner, may remain, but you may understand it in a different way and use different words for it. So I think that's actually kind of almost like a metacognitive housekeeping that you need to do.
It goes back, and another way of saying too what John just said is, Adler's idea of doing an inspectional read. You're going into a new area, so do a quick cursory glance over. If you were looking at Zettelkasten, so go look at Bob's book, look at Aaron's book.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely only Scott Shepard's book. But you'll get an idea of what the general look of the space is, what some of the terms are.
Yeah.
And then as you're delving in more deeply, then you have a better ability to create, in your case, Dan, your tagging question is, even if it's quick throwaway tags, you're really creating a personal index of the book you're reading for your purposes. Yeah. Now, the professional index at the back may be super useful for you to kind of do a quick skim. And usually it's one of the first things I'll read in most books is I'll go through, and there's no better way to know what's in a book than to look at the index and which sections are the deepest and densest.
Right. Or I suppose also to develop a vocabulary of tags that you can then use as ideas come up.
Yeah. But you also have to be aware too that, the same ideas pop up throughout history, and they're all going to have different words and different names and different meanings. And being aware that that's the case, then choose one.
As someone who's been reading and taking notes for 50 years in psychology, but who has only come to Zettelkasten in the last couple of years, I can say without any hesitation at all whatsoever that exactly what makes all my old notes completely inaccessible to me today is that I was not processing them in this way that Doto talks about, and that other people who write on Zettelkasten talk about. I think you have to do some processing in a timely manner. Otherwise, the notes are going to be just as lost to you as they were when you put them in a spiral-bound notebook as an undergraduate in 1972, which is where all my old stuff is gone. So I think you have to have a balance that, I read that about Luhmann being tethered to his Zettelkasten, and I thought, man, that's an ideal life. I would read, eat, feed my animals, read, eat, feed my animals, sleep, get up and do it again. If all I did was read, write, and take notes, I'd be happy. But, you really have to have some balance. But you can't not process is what I'm saying, because the whole point of Zettelkasten is to make it accessible. The other thing that I think is important is, yes, it is perfectly okay to leave notes in sort of a raw status in a reference note or in your inbox or your sleeping folder. But the other thing that I have noticed is something as simple as preparing a lecture. If I did not process those notes when I came in, it's hours and hours of massive amounts of work to find the notes and distill them and say what I want to say. Whereas if I had thought, man, I'd really like to tell my students this, and wrote it that way when I put it in my main notes, then, when I do get ready to plug it into a lecture, it's there, it's ready to go. So I think you have to have a balance. So this whole conversation of I don't want to process first, I'm going to live to process, like Lumon did. You have to have a balance.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
So
I think
how would your
the
life have been
process-
different, Virginia,
And-
had you done
and-
that from the start?
Oh, and one more thing before I answer your question, Dan. What Chris said about vocabulary changing, the beauty of processing is that when you have just read a book that calls it short notes or note size or whatever that was, and now you are reading a book that calls it atomic notes, you can make that linkage. You'll never lose those old notes.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the nice thing with Obsidian is, of course, that it has a function called alias. So I can have the word Chris as an alias of Dan because I really mean this club as a source, for instance, or more particularly, one of the better uses is something like COVID equals C19 equals C-19, such that with a multitude of people writing about SARS and N5H1, they all cross over link either via a deliberate join-up note, or in many cases, you just use the alias. So the other one that's always often a problem is those people that go, in my terms, Bushel Tim versus Tim Bushel, because many search engines don't recognize those two as the same. Calibra does, coincidentally, just put another shout out for them, but not everything does. And the other nice thing that I wanted to butt in with Chris,
Reclaiming my time. There were 3 questions on the table. One, yes, it's an Aura ring. Yes, I have a Zettelkasten, and that's electronic. It's in Obsidian. It was an Evernote, but I'm working on moving. Evernote's going to remain my personal filing cabinet. I'm moving my Zettelkasten stuff into Obsidian. And 3, I cannot imagine how my life would be different. I'm constantly telling my students, you will love yourself for this 20 years from now. You will love yourself for this 20 years from now. You've got to start, a knowledge management program now. Mm-hmm. I can't imagine how much easier my life would be. I spend a lot of time going back and pulling old books off the shelf and looking for stuff. And it's kind of an ADHD thing, for the intellect, is that if any of you have ADHD, how much time do you spend just looking for shit? Mm-hmm. I wish I had done this as soon as it became possible to do this on a laptop. I really do. Yeah. But anyhow, I'm going to give it back to Tim, and I've got groceries on the porch, and so I'm going to have to go.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Virginia.
Thank y'all.
Bye.
And Tim.
And the other Obsidian function that I'm particularly enjoying now is I can retitle a note, and of course, all the links are maintained. It doesn't dump you. Whereas Evernote, for instance, you retitle the note, you're screwed. It breaks the links. And on the upside, though, Evernote 3 months ago has now got bi-directional links, whereas before it was only one direction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which is a huge improvement. Yeah, it wouldn't be useful to me without the link back. But I do, yeah, I like the idea of the naming. I like the idea. I have done quite a bit of aliasing. But what about this question of, we've been sort of talking back and forth around the idea of jamming things in, of collecting, and then massaging and thinking about these things, or processing them, if we want to use that term. But then what about this idea of removing? I mean, it's kind of come up in what Bob's been talking about a little bit. And I think Aaron's, did assume that a fleeting note was, something that you scribble on the back of an envelope or a receipt or something. You're not keeping it. But now, if we're doing this digitally, we have this capability of hanging on to these things, and and maybe, and even if they're not a set of highlights that are coming in via some type of automation, even if it's just a fleeting note, just something that, in a daily, I think of my daily notes as kind of a mash of potential things that could be fleeting notes. But I never delete anything.
I would say that, like, why would you keep random scribbles that don't over time contribute to anything? You might write something down in a moment, and then you look the next day, and you're like, am I stupid? Like, that happens to me sometimes. I'm not sure if it happens to other people. Sometimes I note down something, like I'm looking back, I'm like,
Yeah.
this is such a bad idea. Why would I keep that? And because it's a quick capture, um, it doesn't have the components and the kind of the kind of meat that I want it to have. If I go back to my fleeting notes, or like a fleeting note from like 15 years down, like let's say 15 years later, I go back to a fleeting note 15 years before, it's going to be unintelligible, it's going to be worthless, and it's not going to make much sense, in my opinion. That's kind of my stance. I think the comment of Chris in the chat is also like, why would you keep that? Like, that's kind of how I look. The things you do kind of develop a bit, like kind of when you're reading, annotating, indexing stuff, making main notes, index entries. I would never delete that, because has been linked, annotated, connected to something. There's a lot of context within those notes. So I would never delete that, right? So that's kind of how I would. Fleeting notes is like one of the things that I just delete. I sometimes scan through my fleeting notes, and then I'm like, I take like 1 out of 20 or like 1 out of 15 or 10 that I'm like, oh, that's very interesting. The rest I just delete, or sometimes I delete a few and then keep the other ones, and then I kind of return back, and then I delete a few more, pick one, leave the other one. So it's kind of that's kind of my process.
Mhm. Well,
Yeah.
I will say I don't think any of this is really what I'm suggesting is normative, right? I just think from my perspective, my interest is in in change over time, right? So I am curious about how my thinking about something, or or the way I understand something might change over time. I'm also kind of curious, I think, about what it's connected to, because and maybe this has to do with style, right? If I do, if I'm writing these sort of rambling stream of consciousness kind of essays that a bunch of ideas come up in, then the context in which they come up might down the line be relevant. What they're adjacent to in that stream of consciousness might provide some type of insight. So that's why I wouldn't necessarily delete it. I mean, I'm saying if it's like the bandwidth versus storage capacity thing in the Duran Lanier story. I mean, if I've got the storage capacity, then hell with it, I'm going to leave it.
Yeah,
Well, the cool thing
it
is
would
with the
be like
daily notes
throwing away a
basically
book.
is that the daily notes basically provide even like a kind of like a framework every day, and you don't even, because I also use daily notes quite a lot, and I write down like you, Dan. But the cool thing is that I don't have to process it. I mean, I can process it. I can then put like basically fleeting notes from this, but I don't have to. Well, it's still there, and I also have to delete it. I just can like move it into archive. If I want to go back, it's still there, but it's kind of like almost like a pre-selection of creating a fleeting note by itself, because it's just like a daily note, and it always links back to this particular day or week or whatever. Which I'm totally with you on this. It's so nice to actually understand what you were thinking at a certain point in time. And I'm also trying to figure out how can I actually do that in a bit more, sophisticated way, maybe with some data view or so in Obsidian, to know, okay, on this day or in this week, I actually was thinking about these things, or these things were important to me. That it's it's almost like traveling back in time, and I saw a few times already that this is really, really beneficial.
Yeah, I think it's almost like I mean, I'm a Mac user, right? So I have this little clock thingy up at the top, for my time machine backup. And you don't go back in and edit edit your 6 months ago desktop because you've got a better version. I mean that's almost kind of the logic behind, or the thought process behind the evergreen note refinement argument, isn't it? That we're going to continue to work on this idea, make it a better and better idea, and discard the old ones. But I think there's something to be probably learned retrospectively from the evolution of the idea, but only if the previous iterations of them are still available to you.
One of the few places I've done anything kind of close to automation is taking some of the podcast segments I've done on the comics after I've read them and stuff, and then doing speech to text in it so I can turn them into source notes for later use. So,
yeah.
Because I think having your thoughts at some point in time to reference back to, it may spark other ideas later. It may show, hey, I've thought about it one way at one point, another point, and change my mind and back and forth or what have you.
Yeah, I want to talk about I think it's part 2. I think it's the last chapter of part 2, which is about, let's say you have like a lot of main nodes or like a lot of reference nodes for me. How do you navigate that? How do you find your way back? And I think Bob talks about it. Let me see. I think from the top of my head, it's the hub nodes, structure nodes, and the index. I think Bob coins it that way. And I actually wanted to comment on that because I have never really liked all of these different terminologies myself. I found that having an index is all I need, and calling a hub node different from a structure node, different from an index, is very weird to me. It's like I kind of understand the different types of ways of indexing. That's kind of how I view it. But like I think hub node is like, because then if you were to create a hub node, it would be called Zettelkasten hub node. If you were to create a structure node, and Bob distinguishes them, it will be called Zettelkasten structure node. And if it's a index entry, you would have to call it Zettelkasten index node. I just call it Zettelkasten, and I can do everything within that node. So the hub functionality, which is essentially tracking streams of thought within my Zettelkasten that I can do in the same index entry, in the index node, that's how I call it. The structure node is like outlining the node, Zettelkasten node itself. I can do in that thing as well. And I can also use it as an index for my Zettelkasten nodes and whatever I've read. So I kind of really oppose, and I think I'm not sure if I've done that to Bob, but Bob actually recently came out with an article about the distinction between the hub node and structure node, I think. And I just disagree with him, like fundamentally. It's like I know it's part of the Zettelkasten discourse. I just really don't like the approach. I don't really know a person that does all of these different types of nodes. Maybe you can find some of it in Luhmann, his system himself, but it's for me, I think Luhmann did it very informally. He didn't stick to the terminologies. He didn't care. I think he did some things to find his way back, but I don't think it was this kind of this node, that node, that node, and it just does for me all the same basically. So
yeah, well, I think you're right. I think it is not helpful, and this is something I did kind of criticize to his face Scott for. It was this idea of creating a religious context around what Luhmann said and what
I don't think Bob is religious though. So I just to kind of I did critique him here, but like I don't think he's religious. So
no, I was saying Scott. I was saying Scott Schemmer actually. Created this structure. And he was the interpreter of the prophet kind of thing. But realistically, I do think that it makes some sense. To sort of think through. The process that we actually use. And one of the reasons that I sort of bounced back a couple of years ago between paper, between cards and Obsidian was I was having a lot of trouble getting stuff out of Obsidian, right? So, and I haven't really thought through Bob's different, the different designations for these types of notes, but if it has to do with the stage along his writing process, of collecting and then massaging and relating ideas and then lining them up to be used and pushing them out the other end. I think that could be valuable to be very sort of self-aware about.
Yeah, the thing though is that because I've done Bob's course, so I know him I know his systems pretty well, and I've kind of asked a lot about this stuff.
Mhm.
Is that he doesn't even use any of those notes, I believe, from what I've seen from his system. He doesn't use an index. He uses tags, but it's not really an index like the Zettelkasten and how I would do it. It's very broad, and it's not really, it's for me, it's not really an index in my opinion. He doesn't really use hub nodes. He did make some example kind of demos of how to make a structure node, but he doesn't really use. What he does is he does writing. So he has like hundreds upon hundreds of writing documents, and whenever he's like, these multiple nodes are related and I can do something with them, he just puts them into a writing document and he then massages it there. So that's his process. He's a writer, right? So I actually really like that about Bob and how he does it.
Mhm.
And that's why I don't really like him. Okay, of course, you have to kind of make a Zettelkasten, but by describing it, you don't even know the process of indexing. He doesn't even know it, and he's proposing that you do it this way, but he doesn't even know it. So yeah,
That is challenging.
I find it pretty edgy, right? Like, yeah. So
Yeah, I agree. I think, when I was writing the version with the cat picture on mine, I was, I had just talked to Scott. I did a video that I put on YouTube of me sort of us each sort of interrogating each other about our process. And I was sort of flirting with the idea of going to paper at that point. And so I created this whole section of that, which I'm going to remove or greatly alter, about a numbering system, which I don't use. Right. And so, but it was obligatory, right? Oh, when people do, Luhmann adjacent note making, they talk about a numbering and indexing system. So I really did feel an obligation to talk about that, which was probably realistically in retrospect kind of inappropriate. I should have stuck with what I actually was doing, and then maybe just made these other things available as, this is what some people do, this is what some people do, this might work for you, kind of thing.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm thinking about.
Or if you're going to do it, you have to explain why it was done and the context and what the actual affordance is that you get out of it. Almost not a week goes by that somebody says, should I be using these? Should I not? Should I be using a date timestamp ID of some sort?
Mhm.
And they'll
Right.
use phrases like, UID or GUID, which come from computer science that are tangential, but invariably the people who use a date timestamp at the front of their notes in digital contexts, it's just extra data that they're capturing that they're never ever using. There's no affordance in doing that.
Computer files have a create date, update, modified date, transfer to somewhere else date. The annoying thing comes though when it has got mentioned in passing is when you get a new laptop and you copy stuff over, depending on exactly how you copy it over. Oh,
Creates
look,
new
it'll
file
create
creation
it today.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
So I'm curious at the moment if you hard code in the properties to an Obsidian file, therefore a markdown file. If I say create date was whenever and modified date is today, and then I move it from one computer to another on a stick or an email or whatever, how much I keep. But it's odd that I haven't seen anybody really use the date as the automatic Zettelkasten that you can do within Obsidian, for instance, as a useful thing, because you can't find from the title what you want to do, what you want, unless you then add things past the date and timestamp. And putting a date timestamp in the daily note to say at 2:30 I created the next page of notes on this book, for instance, would may be useful, but it's at least in one place. And it's identifiable because it's this book and the date is incidental. But 10 years down the line, the date today or even this month, let alone this year, is probably of no consequence.
I mean, when I was reading through this section this time, my thought was, why not just have a consecutive number, give it essentially a primary key in database terms? But the way Doto refers to it, he at one point early on kind of makes it analogous to like the Dewey Decimal System of it gets you to the right area of the Zettelkasten and you'd find things around it that might be useful and stuff. Again, that whole serendipity thing. And he was also using the length of the alphanumeric alternating back and forth to indicate, oh, this is a well-developed idea and therefore it's useful for fodder for an article or something like that.
That is a good heuristic, I think.
Well, oddly enough, the Dewey Decimal System is used in a video or two by Morgan as in how not to do it, because it only has one possible place to be, and so she uses the analogy of where would I look for? She's doing a climate essay from memory, and Mary Robinson is one of her source authors. So where's Mary's book? In Dewey Decimal System, it has one and only one place.
Well, that's why I thought Bob was a little inconsistent, because he was suggesting you follow this methodology so it can be both wherever it needs to be, because there's no particular place it has to be. So you could give it a random number, but by giving it this kind of a number, you would find it when you're looking in this general area and stuff. So again, I thought
but if you've got electronic, you go Mary Robinson, and how many times do you say Mary Robinson? Rather saying like Chris said the other day about like a tickler note, and it was like, how often does TK come up as a pair of letters within English language? So you can use that as a very fast search item because it doesn't happen very often, or never happens even in natural language.
The issue with the numbers and numbering and why Luhmann numbered anything is because prior to this, and if you look at Johannes Eric Hade's book that he borrowed his system from, or at least according to his son, who said he had this book, he read it, he used it around the time he started it. Yeah. Everything was done in a common placing system, and most people had a commonplace book, and they would, you don't know where, because you can't plan ahead. I'm going to have notes on government, so I'm not going to have a book titled G, and I may only fill 3 pages of it in my life, so why bother? So you would just chronologically take the notes and put them in your notebook, and then you would have an index at the back or a separate place or a separate, W. Ross Ashby had a card index, and he used index cards to index what was in his notebooks. And that was the common thing. So, but what Luhmann is doing, instead of using a topical heading, here are all my things on sociology and government as they interrelate. And then you could put everything either before or after that tab index card and have it there. Well, he is specifically saying, I want to be able to move my stuff around, but it needs a permanent number on it so I can find it again in the future.
Well, and that's where the Zettelkasten is both very much like and very much not like a database, because both need that primary key to have a pointer back to that idea. But in a database, it almost doesn't matter what that idea is as long as it's consistent over time. Whereas in the Zettelkasten, because you're branching ideas off of it and storing them in that area for easy physical findability later, the number has meaning in it, baked in, because it's, well, this is based off this previous note.
Yeah, and also I think, John, to go back to what you said earlier, I think that's part of that whole thing. You get to see what's adjacent to the node, what's connected to them, how that conversation develops, how deep it goes based on the length of the
Positionality matters in
and
that
then
way,
also
yeah.
grouping, right? And then where, and in the Communication mit Zettelkästen, he talks about, some nodes you'll never see them again, and other ones will develop these families of, of branches and things, and that again is some type of self-checking, mechanism, some type of, metacognition that allows you to say, oh, this is what I'm really interested in.
Well, in that context, and as an ex-librarian, I know the Dewey Decimal System quite well. The Morgan example she came up with, or that she was talking through, was clearly the Dewey Decimal System is relatively old. I've got no idea when it actually started off the top of my head. Mm-hmm. But Mary Robinson's book, or maybe the other book she was using in the example, was on climate justice, which doesn't have a section in Dewey Decimal.
Sure.
So the closest thing they got to was sociological problems, other environmental. And therefore it went into a place that nobody else would ever go to in that context, versus a free-form database style search. You'll find it because it's Mary Robinson, or it's climate justice, or it's climate law, climate regulation. It's a piece of cake. And therefore you either tag and or you link. So I'm more than happy to tag or link rather than worry about how big my Zettelkasten digit is at the front to say, this is a well-connected node. This is a well-developed idea. And so index-wise, though, I'm happy to use those because then you end up with rather like Nick Milo's MOCs type idea. Same thing.
Well, I wanted to kind of bring up those, maps of content or whatever as sort of an alternative to or is it an alternative? Is it the thing that you do in a digital system where in a card-based system you would have an index, a drawer of index cards? Is that the way we understand that?
What was the question?
Well, I just so what I wanted to kind of bring maps of content into the conversation a little bit because I'm not using them right now. I have tried them before, after I watched some Nick content, and I had a conversation with him on YouTube once too. And
yeah, I would say, I think it is literally the same as the hub structure node index maps of it's for me. It's like, what, why? Like an index is all I need. And what I do is I just make another node called hubs or whatever, or top level index nodes. And then I put them there so I can navigate there. So I think maps of content, I think Nick Milo, he was part of the Zettelkasten DE forum / before even Obsidian came to be. This is what I know, is that he was part of that forum, and he actually used, I don't know which tool they use again.
It seemed very Notion-esque to me.
Yeah, so the Zettelkasten DE forum use a tool. I forgot the archive or the archive, and he was using that, and he saw that Sasha and so on, and I think other people were using the structure node. So he just took that and called it a maps of content. So it's nothing new, like it's just the same thing. And it's just adding, I kind of understand what Nick is doing, but one problem I have with Nick is he's just giving terms for every single one process. He's like, oh, this thing, that thing, this thing.
Except there's a different right. I mean, yes, there is a lot of branding going on. I agree.
Yeah.
But the other thing that strikes me about that is, and it was the same sort of objection I had to Notion, was that it's a top-down, you create a structure and then and you've sort of predetermined. It's not emergent at all. It doesn't really evolve unless you kind of just refactor all of your,
Well,
010,
Yeah.
030, kind of designations that you've made for your numbering system, and
from what I've watched of Nick's stuff, which has not been a lot, I just found him a little trying to be more impressive than he was, I guess would be a bad way to put it. But it seemed like it was covering a weakness of the system of I couldn't find the stuff otherwise. So I had to, it emerged I needed a system. So he'd put the map of content out there and link out to the other stuff as again, kind of an index or whatever. And I would think with like Obsidian, if you've tagged, linked, or whatever your notes, you would already have that through the graph view or something like that. But it always, part of why I stopped watching Nick's stuff is it always felt like he was trying to be more profound than I felt he was.
Hmm.
Well,
And part of
there's
that was just his presentation and marketing style.
some of it, if there's not a word for the thing that you're trying to describe, it can be useful to have a method of describing what the thing is so that you can get, and there is an affordance that you get out of having that as a thing. So,
Sure.
as an example, I've been reading Eustace's Miles book on note taking and writing, which is not too dissimilar from Dan's book with the elder Alasso. But he's in 1905 or even the late 1800s when he actually wrote it, is a top of the heap tennis player, and he actually wins the silver medal in real tennis when it was an Olympic sport in 1908. But learning how to play tennis and being good at it is different than scaffolding your way up to learning it. So in there he talks about how do you break things down into the tiniest pieces to describe what's going on so that someone else can follow your method and do it, which is all we're doing here. How do you break down the pieces? And in Miles's version, he, talks about collecting, organizing, then you select the things you've collected that you want to do something with, and then you arrange them in some kind of arrangement or outline, and then you go in and you use your notes to fill in the gaps and then write and finish the stuff. And that's all this process is. And we're giving all kinds of crazy wackadoo names like maps of content for it. And is it really that complicated? But at the same time, the other side of the coin is Zettelkasten has become a thing, and we use it as a word to describe a process now because we have lost the words for what this were that existed in the early 1900s. In the early 1900s, you could use the phrase card system or card index, and almost everybody in society, certainly the business world, would know exactly what you meant. They would know you were talking about a Zettelkasten for your business or for your writing process or whatever that was. And you can go back in these videos and I'll harp on it to no end. And I've mentioned it probably every 6 months that Vannevar Bush destroyed computer science for the last 75 years because he wrote this article in 1945, as we may think, and he invents this new word, memex, to describe a commonplace book. Had he used the word commonplace book, or had he used the phrase card index or card system, everybody would have known what he was talking about, and it would have been an easy jump into here's how we do things. But instead, all these new computer scientists reinvent the wheel from scratch with new terminology and new words. And, we're all used to them now, but we now, as a result, have forgotten all of the old words we used for these things.
Yeah.
And
You won't get promoted.
So here we are doing Zettelkasten practice and coming up with new words for these easy English things that we've been doing all along, and overcomplicating it and making it, in fact, Bob's entire book, he starts out with, here's a list of these words and terms and what I mean by them, and other variations so that when you're reading online, but he's writing a book to clarify all the terminology. The process is the process.
Mhm.
And
But I
if
think
you've never done it before, it's useful to know what that is.
But we need the terms to talk about it, but then it gets to the point where all we're talking about is the terms.
Right.
And
Well,
that's
and
the
all we're arguing about is the fine point of how we do the thing when it should be unique and idiosyncratic enough, probably, for us to do the thing that we need to do to get to where we're going. But I do think there is a question involved in this in this issue of indexes, maps of content, and that goes that the thing that I'm curious about is, does the structure of knowledge come before what fills it, or does it evolve out of what fills it? And that's why I think the Zettelkasten or the node system or the Obsidian Vault or of each of us is different, because not so much because of the hierarchy of the nodes that we imagine or whatever, as the things that we put into it that then sort of inform it, and the way that we deal with those ideas kind of evolves out of the ideas that we're using. I can imagine having a different process for a different goal, right? If I were writing a novel, I imagine my thing would look a whole lot different from, writing a nonfiction history or I think that I think it's interesting how the tools and the ways we use them differ depending on what it is we're actually doing with them. I mean, you can hammer a nail with a shovel, but maybe you don't want to.
Well, last week, I think at some point there was talk about the continuation of the dead author's work, and I was going to push in at that point. There are things like the radio program The Archers, the English TV Coronation Street. These have had teams of writers over generations, and the listener or the watcher knows the program very often as well as the writers do, and they write in to complain about when there's a continuity error whereby all of a sudden Fred suddenly had 6 sons and 2 daughters and not 5 daughters and 3 sons or something like that. So there's a huge card index type, which may well be electronic made now, at the BBC for The Archers, which is also, because it's a radio program, you don't have the visual issue of having actors replaced that don't look like each other from one season to another, but need to sound similar at least. And clearly there's a system there that is using something like maybe Scrivener to keep track of the recurrent writing using storyboard, come data cards, come here is the current cast of this episode. Here is their cast sheet. Here is their character listing. And you go and dip into some of the stuff written about Scrivener for those people that plan their fictional writing. And they're all starting off with write all the locations down, write all the characters down, make a sheet for each of them, make sure you know.
That's a concordance, yeah.
Yeah, so you end up with a concordance both of locations, of events, of characters. You might even, because the file system can do it, you drop in pictures of people that look like the character, or you draw them in some way that allows you to visually remember what they look like, etc., etc. And then you've got then you write out the history, and it's history in this novel, and it's also the history for the next novel and the novel after that. And it seems strange that many of the items we have within the Obsidian structure, stroke the Zettelkasten structures, aren't being echoed from a Scrivener point of view in quite the same way. But we've got the canvas and we've got the Scrinsel app instead, so it gives us a canvas. And we've got a canvas that says we can put cards anywhere and move them around and use it like a storyboard to allow us to plan out and do outlines graphically rather than sitting them in Word with a list of paragraph numbers and section numbers.
Yeah. I think that there's a work style that finds that to be that really facilitates that for a lot of people. I think we are just about out of time. I wanted to Florian made a point about the use of the term rhizome, which was kind of jarring to me as well. Just the idea that this is a term that carries a lot of baggage for me, in which not all bad, but certainly predisposes me to think in a particular way when I'm thinking using that terminology. I'm curious how people think about the use about the way that Bob has sort of brought in his baggage of his different, of a bunch of different belief systems, and how they inform this, and whether it's helpful or.
I thought it was unnecessary, and it really was unnecessary. And it was an example in his own book of dragging in too much from his Zettelkasten into his book. And there are examples later on where he, I guess,
it's littered with examples.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. I mean, I think you're right. It's littered. I mean, you have to use an example, but but somehow it seemed more benign when he was talking about his own notes about Buddhism or whatever than than when he just dropped this into the thing, which comes with a whole set of assumptions.
His examples were either apples, which I thought was pretty banal
that was
and boring, or they were on some of the mysticism and spirituality and stuff like that, which I didn't really have enough context for to really kind of get some of his example there. So I think finding a more accessible middle ground for those examples would have been good.
Yeah.
And some of this whole stuff with the rhizome stuff, it didn't really mean anything in particular to me.
Yeah, I mean, a rhizome is an interesting metaphor. But yeah, in that case, again, maybe it has to do with where the reader is coming from. In that case, it had a huge context, and where the Sufi mysticism or Buddhism, I didn't really have any experience with, so that I could treat just as an example. Yeah. Anyways, we are at 12:03. So if I am going to make this work as a 2-hour edit, and take advantage of some of the affordances of Vimeo, we will need to. I can cut a couple of minutes when we're just a few of us are chatting at the beginning off, and so that'll be easy enough. But so for next week, we should just validate that we are finishing. Correct? Okay.
And we'll put the bug into people's ears to start thinking about book the next.
Yeah, and I would be. I mean, it may not end up being an entire multi-week book read, but maybe some of the other people here would be interested in running through Beatrice Webb's.
I saw a recent book. I don't know. It's a book suggestion. I can also mail it to you if it's, or can I say it right now? Is it?
Yeah,
fine?
go ahead. Sure.
So I think Harari had recently.
Oh yeah, the one about AI. Yeah.
Not AI, but I think he talks about information.
Okay.
History of information, which I think kind of is in line with the book club to some degree.
Yeah, I think he goes to
Nexus.
AI, but yeah, I think it's Nexus. Yeah. My dad's loving that right now. He's a Harari fan though.
Yeah, I'm like in the middle about Harari. I think he's also a futurologist, and that's kind of tricky with being an historian, right? So that's
and a little bit too illogical. Yeah, exactly. Yep.
I feel guilty. I got an early copy of that book like months and months ago, like January, I think, and I still have not cracked it.
Well,
maybe you can like a suggestion, right? So maybe
Yeah.
we can.
Okay. Okay. Cool. And yeah, and anybody else has other ones? Yeah, we will break now, but definitely there's a page in the vault for suggesting and voting on books. So so we can do that. We historically have sort of bounced back and forth between knowledge system ideas and some and some other topics. So you can kind of go back through the all of the different folders and see other types of stuff that we've done if you're new, and that doesn't determine anything, but it suggests a range of interests that we've had in the past. Okay, so thanks very much. This was fun. I appreciate it.
Bye.
Take care.